Hi, welcome. I'm Miguel Jiménez. I'm director of the Lit Luz Book Club. Thank you for joining us tonight. This event tonight is in English with live Spanish translation. So I'll give you some steps on how to access the English to Spanish translation tonight. Um, if you're new to the Lit Luz Book Club, just want to share that it's a book club where we read authors from Mexico City and or from Mexico and Chicago in the United States. And we read the books during the summer, and the festival, the Lit and Loose Festival, happens in the fall, where we get to meet some of the authors that we read over the summer. So far, we have read Written After a Massacre by Daniel Bunzutsky, and tonight's book will be Jazmina Barrera's On Lighthouses, Cuaderno de Faros. And we still have three more books that we're going to be reading over the summer, or what's left of the summer. So we have Red Ants, Hormigas Rojas by Argentino Jose. We have Diorama by Rocio Ceron. And we have Too Much Midnight by Krista Franklin. So if you're interested, please sign up for book club announcements and links through the form in the chat that you'll see momentarily. Before we begin tonight's event, I also want to announce that we're excited that we're to have the 2021 Chicago Lit and Loose Festival take place November 1st through the 6th. It'll be a hybrid festival with online and in-person events. And this year's host of our live magazine show is the University of Chicago's Logan Center for the Arts. So if you want to learn more about the festival and participants and programs, please sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media. Links will also pop up in the chat. Tonight, we're really happy, as I mentioned earlier, to have Jazmina Barrera to discuss her book on Lighthouses, Cuaderno de Faros. Jazmina Barrera will be in Chicago November 1st to the 6th for the festival. And we have special guest Kyle Beachy. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce him right now. I do want to remind you that after the conversation between Jazmina Barrera and Kyle Beachy, we will have a Q&A. So please submit any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll take those questions and pass them forward and ask them to Jazmina after her conversation with Kyle Beachy. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest for the night. Jazmina Barrera was born in Mexico City in 1988. She was a fellow at the Foundation for Mexican Letters. Her book of essays, Cuerpo Extraño, Foreign Body, was awarded the Latin American Voices Prize for literal publishing in 2013, from literal publishing in 2013. She has published her work in various print and digital media, such as Paris Review, El Malpensante, Words Without Borders, Nexos, Letras Libres, and Electric Literature. She has a master's degree in creative writing in Spanish from New York University, which she completed with support of a Fulbright grant. Her book on Lighthouses, translated by Christina MacSweeney, was published in 2020 by Two Lines Press. She is editor and co-founder of Ediciones Antilope. She lives in Mexico City. And before I introduce our special guest author, I almost forgot to explain how to access the Spanish to English translation. So let me do that now. Este evento incluirá traducción en vivo del inglés al español a través de Zoom. Así que si quiere acceder, eso está por separado. La traducción está en vivo de inglés al español y le queremos agradecer a Lucía, Corneja y Lilia Hijuelos por eso. Se puede acceder por la traducción esta noche. Ese link se puede acceder debajo del video del YouTube, así que en la descripción está un enlace que le pueden hacer el clic para acceder a esa traducción a través de Zoom. So if you're interested in the English to Spanish translation, you can easily access the translation by clicking the Zoom link below the video, and that'll take you straight to the simultaneous translation. Back to where we were. Now let me introduce our special guest author here, who will be in conversation with Jazmina. It's Kyle Beachy. Kyle Beachy's first novel, The Slide, won the Chicago Reader's Best Book by a Chicago Author Reader's Choice Award for the year. His short fiction has appeared in journals including Fanzine, Hank, Hobart, Juke, The Collages, Five Chapters, and others. The most fun thing, his most recent book, his new book, is a hybrid of critical and personal writing, sections of which have appeared in The Point, The American Reader, The Chicagoan, Free Skateboard Magazine, The Skateboard Mag, Genchem, Deadspin, and The Classical. He teaches at Roosevelt University in Chicago and is a co-host on the skateboarding podcast Vent City with pro skater Ryan Lay and others. So without further ado, here are Jazmina Barrera and Kyle Beachy.
Thank you very much, Miguel. Thank you to Meg, to Sarah Dodson for having me here for this very, very exciting conversation. Jazmina, it's a pleasure to meet you. Hello, welcome.
It's a pleasure, Kyle. Thanks to everyone for doing this. I'm really excited.
So we don't have nearly, not even close to enough time to have the nature of conversation that I want to have with you about this book. This marvelous book, this stunning, this quietly, profoundly impactful book, enough to make me say impactful, a word that I but so I want to sort of organize our conversation, if I can, around one of the book's major themes, which is distance. But in fact, it's not just a theme in this book. Probably one of the things that I love most about this book is the way that it actually creates the physical sensation of distance for the reader. So distance is both, on one hand, your subject matter, and it's also a sort of formal technique, it feels like, in this book, which results, as I say, in this sort of affect for the reader. I feel at once this profound intimacy with you, a person I don't know at all, but also this necessary and uncrossable distance throughout the book. So if that's okay with you, we'll start with kind of distance. So we're now several years since this book was originally published in Spanish, and longer, surely, since you wrote it. So I wonder if you could start off this conversation by saying, first of all, a little bit about where and how you were when you were in the midst of writing this book. And then secondly, what is it like now that there is this kind of distance between the you who you are now and the you who is narrating this book on Lighthouse?
Yes, thank you, Kyle. So I started writing this book about 6 years ago, maybe. I was living in Mexico City and I had a grant to write in this house. You had to go every day and write, just sit there and write. And I was feeling a bit claustrophobic, I think. So I started to write about travels. And I wanted to write about a particular travel I had done a couple of years before that to the coast of Oregon, which is the first chapter of the book. It's a journey I made with my family to visit a small town in the coast of Oregon that had a beautiful lighthouse, and that had also a very strange hotel that was dedicated to literature and had all of the rooms were dedicated to a single author and had the complete works of the author, and they were decorated according to the author. It was so funny, and I loved it. So I wanted to write about that travel, also because I was reading Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and I wanted to write about the experience of reading that book and the experience of traveling to a lighthouse at the same time. And I started to do a little research on lighthouses and just completely fell in love with lighthouses, with the historical lighthouses, the history of lighthouses, the literary lighthouses, everything about lighthouses became an obsession for me. And I also started traveling to lighthouses every time I got the chance, which wasn't very often because Mexico City is far away from the beach. So this is a book I wrote for a long time. I think it was 3 years maybe. So then I probably started writing it 8 years ago. I'm confused with time right now. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it took a long time to write because I was writing it as I traveled to lighthouses, which, as I said, wasn't very often. Yeah. So it became sort of like a travel journal and at the same time a research journal for this lighthouses obsession.
Yeah. And part of that has to do, and this ties into distance as well, with verb tense, right? I mean, there is, late in the book, you get into actually adopting some of the formal conceits of a diary, which you don't do in the earlier chapters. And you several times throughout this book kind of comment on verb tense, whether there seems to be some question whether you should be writing in the past tense or writing in the present tense as it's ongoing. So it's very interesting for me to hear that it's a book that's you sort of lived with for a while and kind of composed as you move through the world. Is that often how you write, or is this the only project of yours that sort of works that way?
No, I think I really like literature to get confused with life. That has many problems, but it's also really fun for me. So I wrote after that a book on motherhood, and I wrote it through my pregnancy and through breastfeeding. And it was also a book about the transformations of a woman's body during that period. And it's a kind of journal as well. It's a kind of diary that I was writing as I lived through all of that. So yeah, I have many examples of that. It's something I really like to do.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I wonder, it makes me wonder how, if you are sort of writing as you're living and living as you're writing, and the two sort of find their way to coexist or intermingle, what does that do for your sort of sense of how you exist as a character in the book? I guess maybe the better way to say that is, how conscious were you as you were writing this book of the ways that yourself was coming through in the book?
Yeah, so I think with all Lighthouses, I was trying to work with distance, as you said. No, I was also reflecting on subjectivity and objectivity, like writing from the inside, but about the outside, or from the inside towards the inside of myself. I'm sorry, it's so confusing. Then I remember there was a point when I was working this book in a workshop, and someone said, like, you're too absent in this book. We need to see more of the narrator. And I had a sort of crisis with that, which I think was very important for the book, because I started reflecting on why. Why do I want to keep this distance from the reader or from the theme? And I started reflecting on the topic of wealth. So there appeared this symbol. It was on the first hand the lighthouse, which for me represented looking towards the outside, looking towards the horizon, seeing beyond yourself. And then the symbol of the well, which represented introspection and just diving into yourself. So I started playing with that, because they are also like opposite figures, images in a way. And the book, I think, moves around those two images and those two perspectives all the time.
Yeah. No, there is, and I really mean it when I say that there is this sort of it's this sort of strange floating kind of bothness, where I feel at once very close to the narrator of this book, because of course I'm watching your thought process, right? I mean, in a first person nonfiction, non-narrative work like this, of course every movement that you make reveals the mind at work. But at the same time, there are, every now and then I would sort of look up and realize, like, gosh, I don't really know anything about this person, right? I know that she is in New York City, living in an apartment on the 5th floor with a terrible view, and that she seems to, in some ways, long for her home. But beyond that, all we really have is this sort of driving desire, as you called it an obsession earlier. And I'm curious about that desire, because that desire leads to one of the other major themes of this book, which is collecting, right? It's not just a book about lighthouses. It's also very much that sort of next level of remove, which is a book about your interest in lighthouses, of course. And collecting as a practice, to me, feels like this sort of ongoing quest, right? Like, the beauty of collecting is that you can always be looking for something. You're always ready to find the next object of your desire, which is itself a kind of collapsing of distance, right? The opportunity to, each time you find a new one, collapse that distance and be very close. You compare this in the book to the very important preposition at the beginning of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, this sort of to-ness. And this just completely blew me away. You say about that the to of that title becomes an archetype of a promise, the expectation of happiness that can sometimes be confused with, or perhaps is, happiness. That line, I think, should be needle pointed onto a pillow. I think it's just absolutely gorgeous. And elsewhere, you ask if it's possible to separate the concept of collecting from culture. So I wonder if you could say, if you're so bold, what for you the relationship between collecting and happiness is. Does it provide happiness, collecting, or kind of there because you're always looking for more?
Yes. So I think everything is related, like desire, collecting, and distance. Because especially for a collection such as this one, which is a collection of a non-material collection, immaterial collection of experiences, of memories, of images, of literary references, because you cannot really collect lighthouses. So, and it is also an impossible to finish, a collection impossible to finish, because there are so many lighthouses. And so many references to lighthouses in all kinds of discourses. So what I was thinking about distance is that the distance in desire is what creates desire. If you actually get to the object of desire, if you actually finish the collection, desire disappears. If you go inside the lighthouse disappears, because the lighthouse is outside. The lighthouse is the light that moves you. It's the distance that moves you towards the lighthouse. So there is a happiness in that desire, of course, but there's also anguish. There's also anxiety. There's also this sort of excitement that is that confuses, I think, happiness with other emotions. So I would say there's definitely happiness in collecting, but there's many other things that make it more complex than just that.
Yeah. I love that. I love that every time you reach a lighthouse, it's sort of like, well, I saw it, right? I mean, clearly the sort of the important part is the desire and the movement toward it. One of the other things that we cannot ignore is the fact that there is a small but I think important visual element to this collection of essays. Each of these 6 essay chapters opens with a sketch of the lighthouse in question. And you, at several points in the book, speak of maps of lighthouses. You speak of how you yourself drew plans to try to understand the interior of these lighthouses. And at one point you mentioned other schemes, as you call them, to capture and represent lighthouses, something like cubism that might present all of their sides at once. Which makes me think of the form of this book itself. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see this book working as a formal object. Is this book itself a work of cubism?
Yes, so I like to think of this work as a sort of cabinet of curiosities on lighthouses. I really like cabinets of curiosities because they were these eclectic collections that had very small things, very strange things, very domestic daily things mixed with other fantastic objects. And so the way I think I wanted to organize this book was thinking of the fragments in a very visual way, as if they were objects in a collection. As if you could actually, and I actually got a word processor that is called Scrivener that I really recommend, where you can move around little fragments in the form of post-its, and you can form a sort of collage. So I was trying to work with the book in that way, and there are many books that I love that I think work similarly to these. Some of them I actually found after writing this, and I was like, wow, it has cousins. And but for example, I don't know, Maggie Nelson's Bluets, these books about obsessions, that also have this fragmentary way, and that have a very visual playing to them.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Bluets. My next question is really, and I think Bluets is a great sort of counterpoint for this. I wonder, because so much of this book is about movement toward this destination, right? Each of these chapters has the sort of lighthouse as this sort of anchor that you as a character are moving toward. And sometimes it's with friends, and sometimes it's with family. Sometimes it's with a Frenchman who is just obsessed with mussels. I wonder if you can say how important storytelling is to a work like this, because of course a lot of this book isn't storytelling. A lot of this book is research. A lot of this book is compiling and collaging and making textures. Do you think of this book as a work of storytelling or not?
Yes, of course. I think even in the research fragments, there are stories. When I'm talking about Robert Louis Stevenson and his grandfather, there's that story, which is, I think, amazing. But of course, there are many different kinds of storytelling here, and one is more connected to chronicle, I would say. Also, another part is more connected to diaries. Another part is more connected to that research kind of stories. But there is even fiction in a point. Like there's a place where I try to imagine the end of Edgar Allan Poe's final story, which he left incomplete, about a lighthouse. And that is all fiction. I mean, there was nothing else there. So this is a strange book, no doubt, and genres are always a problem for me. But but I conceive essay writing as being very, very closely related to narrative, just process and writing. I don't know if that answers the question.
No, I think it does. I mean, I think the question of how narrative an essay is always a difficult thing to really figure out as we're writing them, as we're reading them, as we're conceiving of them at all as a genre. One of the things that might kind of filter into this question is that there's a very obvious question that your book, I think, marvelously does not answer, which is this. What do you get? What do you take away from visiting these lighthouses, right? I mean, the basic question is, well, why go to them? And one answer, of course, is, well, I'm obsessed with them. But there are a lot of ways to visit a lighthouse that don't involve and travel to them. So why did you need to visit them? And then two, what did you take away after you saw them?
Yes. So as you said, I think that is one of the central questions of the book, and there are many possible answers. And of course, one is because they make me, they allow me to escape myself in a way. They connect me to larger themes, to larger stories in time and in space. And also because each one of them is a universe of stories in itself. And that is what I like. That is what I live for, So lighthouses are sort of like books in that way. They connect me to stories, and to stories that have to do with things I love, with the sea, with solitude, with loneliness, with madness, with many things that interest me. And they keep changing. I don't look at lighthouses the same way I looked at them before the pandemic, for example. To me, the figure of a lighthouse keeper is now connected to the way we had to distance ourselves to people when we were in quarantine. in order to keep them safe, we have to keep that distance from them. Again, distance. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's true also that so many of the stories about lighthouses veer into tragedy, right? I mean, to live under the conditions that these keepers live under, it's just extremely demanding, physically, emotionally, psychologically. I think of the film, which I watched this weekend in honor of this conversation, which is The Lighthouse, which has come recently in the last few years. And of course, one of the kind of notable things of that movie, one of the notable techniques, is that the screen, the dimensions of the screen, right, are in fact closed in on us. It's not widescreen. It's not a 16:9 resolution. It's more like 4:3 or maybe 4:4. It's a square. And so every shot you see, it just sort of explains how close these men are, and their sort of madness and their conflicts and their tensions are inescapable. This book to me seems the absolute opposite of that, right? I mean, this book to me feels like the sea. It feels like the sort of openness and fluidity of the prose is very much mimicked by the kind of very pleasant blue of the color. It is just sort of this fluidity throughout. How did you know what belonged in this book, given that openness and the fluidity, right? I mean, you essentially had carte blanche to go in any direction that you wanted. Were you give you that freedom to just go wherever you wanted, or were there sort of restrictions you put on yourself?
So in the first place, I didn't. I was just collecting anything I could find on and about lighthouses. But then there was a second stage in the writing of this book where I was working with that collage, with that cabinet of curiosities. So then the fragments that went into the book were ones that related to other fragments that made a sort of conversation with the others, even if it was a conversation of contrasts or a conversation of opposites. But there were many travels to lighthouses that I loved, that I didn't write about. There were many objects of lighthouses, many references that I loved that didn't go into this book. Just to give you an example, I traveled to a lighthouse in an island called Isla Magdalena in Chile, which is in like the bottom of the world. And it's this beautiful little island where there is only a lighthouse and a colony of penguins. And for me, it's like the most beautiful place in the world. It's like my favorite place in the world. But somehow it didn't belong in the book. And I think it was just too perfect, too beautiful, too happy. This is a dark book for me. It is a book that reflects a period of depression, I would say, in my life. And this last visit that I did that still could have gone into the book because I had made it before it was published. I chose not to put it in the book because it was just too happy.
That's interesting. You're right that there is this sort of and again, the Maggie Nelson book comes back in here. There is a blueness to this, right? I mean, there is a kind of not overt sadness. It's not that we can pick up necessarily an emotional quote in everything that we read, but there is this sort of sense of it felt to me at times like homesickness. It felt to me at times like a sort of isolation. But it's never overpowering. And I guess what I want to get at, and maybe we're running out of time here, so maybe my last question will be this. And this ties into a little bit in the differences between literary culture in the US and in Mexico, which you have an interesting perspective on, of course, because you did study at NYU for your MFA. This to me feels very much like a book that would be very hard to get published in the US. And I say that with total admiration. Um, what is it like for you to have this book now be translated and be discussed in the U.S.? Is that important? Does that matter to you? And if so, how does it matter? Maybe.
Yes, of course it matters, but I think it doesn't matter to me as much in a career sense. It matters because I wrote a large part of this book in New York, in the United States. It's a book that talks about traveling in the United States. And it's a book that talks about that part of my life where I lived there, in a place I love, in a place I remember with all my heart. And so there's people living there that I care about. There's people living there that only read English that can now read this book, that I care about. So it's important to me in many ways. I also studied English literature, and so for me the tradition that when this book gets translated now is sort of like dialoguing with, is very important as well, and the references are very Anglophone in many parts of the book. It's also a beautiful experience because the translator is my friend, is a person I really care about, and it was a beautiful process translating this book with her, discussing it, creating solutions for difficult problems with the translation. And when I read this book, I hear her voice, and I remember that discussion. And this book in English to me feels, in a way, familiar and new, and that is marvelous. So, because the book in Spanish I've read so much, I sort of like hate it a bit. I love it, but I also kind of hate it. And this is the opposite. This feels like something someone else wrote that totally gets me, something like that.
I think that's probably a really wonderful place for me to bow out. Jazmina, let me just say that I am extremely grateful to the job that Christina MacSweeney has done in translating this book. I'm so happy that it exists in English now, and I look forward to what I love. So thank you very much. This has been a joy.
Thank you so much. We can't hear you, Miguel.
Always forget this. Thank you so much, Jazmina. Thank you so much to Kyle. We have a few questions that have come in for you, from listeners, from people watching, and also from the book club. And actually, maybe this is a good question to ask you now, as Kyle had just, and you were beginning to talk about it. What was the translation process like? We've talked to, I think we had a luck to talk to Christina MacSweeney before, and some of her, and read some of her other works in the book club where she's translated authors from Mexico. And it seems like she has a different process for everyone. What was your process like with Christina MacSweeney?
Yes, it was great. I mean, we've been friends for a long time now, and I think she's been my only constant pen pal. Yeah, because we've had this correspondence for such a long time, and the process of translating this book just felt like such a natural part of that conversation. We exchanged emails with the versions of the translation, with questions, and she came up with wonderful solutions for problems with the translation. So I was just admiring her work all the time. She's such a wonderful writer, not only translator. And it was just lovely.
Yeah, no, as Kyle was saying, I think the translation, we're really happy that it's translated, really happy that Christina MacSweeney is working with a lot of writers from Mexico, and yeah, translating their work so we can read it. There's a question here that there's a suggestion in the book that you know want to stop being obsessed with lighthouses. You had just mentioned it's been such a long time since you wrote this book. Have you been able to stop that obsession with lighthouses, or have they now reappeared in your life now that the book is translated into English?
Yes. So they never went away,
Hmm.
and every time I go to a place where there's a lighthouse, I have to go to the lighthouse, and I prefer traveling to places that have lighthouses than traveling to places that don't. And I'm always going to be obsessed with them. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to write about them again, or not in the way of this book, because and that was a difficult decision, because this book could be eternal. It has that quality, but what happens to me with books is that I them when with something else, and that obsession becomes greater than the previous one. So I wouldn't have a problem just writing this book forever if it wasn't because I wanted to write other books. And now I think I forgot the question.
No, I think you answered it. Yeah, the question was like, if you have stopped your obsession with lighthouses.
Oh yeah, yeah. So no, I love them.
Yeah,
No, they're great.
Just out of curiosity too, so in the book club there were people asking, they're like, they were wondering if you have gotten messages or people sending you pictures of lighthouses, or has that happened?
Oh yes, that's another reason why I can't stop thinking about lighthouses, because this book, I've been very fortunate, or this book has had the great fortune of being not only translated to 4 languages or 3, but some languages, and being published in many places in Latin America with different publishing houses. So it's had a very beautiful life with people in Chile, with people in Argentina, and it makes that happen. People keep sending me postcards, gifts, images when they travel to lighthouses, when they see a beautiful lighthouse, when they find a reference in a book of a lighthouse. A couple of persons have even tattooed themselves lighthouses and sent me the pictures after reading the book. So yes, it keeps lighthouses alive in my life.
This is maybe a good question that has come in also that we could ask that's related to this. Is there a lighthouse that you think people should travel to go see?
Oh yes, so many. Well, go to that one, to the Isla Magdalena lighthouse. That is like the craziest, most beautiful place in the world. And now that climate change is turning everything upside down, I don't know how much longer we will have that lighthouse. So please go now.
Yeah. Okay. Isla Magdalena. Okay. And maybe we have time for one more question. And this is a good one to close on. The book club was really interested in like what your next book is like. You talked about how you have a hard time with genre, and so could you talk a little bit about what Linea Negra is going to look like? Or I know it's already published in Spanish, but it's coming out next year, I think May. What can people expect? Is it also sort of a mix of like this book, which is research, and like you said, a little bit of that little piece of fiction, and diary? What is Linea Negra going to look like?
Look, so Linea Negra is also a really strange book that I usually call an essay, because that's the word I prefer to novel, just because of the connotations of the word essay. But it has just been called a finalist to an award in Mexico that is the first novel award.
Oh, wow.
So I think it might be also a novel. It's a really strange book, and it's a book about, as I said, the transformations in the body of women during pregnancy and breastfeeding, but it is also a collection of references to other women who have worked with that theme in visual arts and in literature. And it's also a book on earthquakes, and it's also a book on painting. So it's also a book on illness. So, but it has a similar format, I would say, to on Lighthouses. There is another book that I'm going to publish in Spanish this fall, and that I would say it's closer to the traditional novel format, but it's also an essay. So, and that one is called Punto De Cruz, which I think is going to be translated as cross stitch. Yeah.
Well, that's a perfect place to end here. I think to give people and those watching and people that like to read you something to look forward to in the next few years, right? So there's 2 more books coming. We're excited about that. Thank you so much, Jazmina, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Kyle, for joining us. Kyle Beachy for joining us today. I have the books here, so I'm going to show them. This is On Lighthouses by Jazmina Barrera and The Most Fun Thing by Kyle Beachy. So get them at your local bookstores, local independent bookstores. Support them. And thank you both very much. I just want to give some additional thank yous to Johnny Barra at Q4 Media for tonight's live stream, and to Jaime Garza of Los Santos for the opening. Flotando by Alma Fuerte is the solo project. Thank you so much to Pilsen Community Books for being our official book club partner. You can find all the book club titles online and in their physical shop in Chicago in the Pilsen neighborhood. We have a few more books. I think we have 3 more books that we're going to read in the book club that will also have events like tonight's. And so please check them out if you're interested. We'd love to have you read the book with us. You can check out the book titles at litluz.org, litluz.org. So please check them out. Next month, we'll be talking to Pergentino Jose with his book Hormigas Rojas, Red Ants. So please read it with us and join us for that conversation. Check out our website, litluz.org, and sign up for the newsletter to also find out about November's Lit Luz Festival, which will include Jazmina Barrera as one of the participants, which we're really excited for. And hopefully we get to take her to one of the 2, I think, lighthouses near the city. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you in Chicago.
Thank you.